Well, good morning. Greetings to you this morning. I'm currently out of town, but I'm still able to preach to you this morning through video. That's a great option that we have. And you're not going to be seeing any PowerPoint on the screens this morning. You're just going to see me. And I'd encourage you to take out the sermon notes that are in your bulletin and feel free to take some notes as the sermon progresses this morning. So I'm happy to be able to be with you in a slightly different format. You know, this morning we are continuing our series exploring the book of James, and I've entitled this series Essential Teachings for Every Christian. And James, as we've talked about, James offers some very practical and everyday teachings which challenge us to look and to live more like Jesus. And so it's an immensely practical book, something that's been a great pleasure and a joy to be able to preach through, and hopefully you've been encouraged by our time together in it as well. To start today, I want to share a phrase with you that's been really meaningful to me. It's been so meaningful that I've attached it actually to the back of my phone, as you can see here, to the back of my phone as a reminder. And it's a quote by St. Ignatius of Loyola, and it says, "Undertake nothing without consulting God." Undertake nothing without consulting God. Or to put this in more common language, don't do anything without talking to God about it. And this short sentence has a wealth of meaning, and it applies really directly to the message that we're going to be looking at, or the message I want to share with you this morning. I think I've probably shared this with you before, but at a previous church, our leadership was going through some important discussions about the future of our church. And we gathered together as pastors and elders to discuss our future and to see how God might be leading us to think and to operate differently so that we could see more people reached for Jesus. There were a couple of us on the leadership team that were really excited about this time of discernment and discussion because we thought that meant that everything was on the table for us to evaluate. We were looking forward to re-examining how we do things as a church in order to be truly relevant to our community. And there were a few of us that felt as though having a discussion around our property was a very important first step in the process of re-examination. And so questions that we had were things like, well, do we need all the property that we have? We're sitting on a tremendous amount of land with multi-millions dollars worth of equity and asset. And should we think about maybe selling some of that land in order that's not being maybe used very well right now in order to be better stewards of the land and the assets and the gifts that God has given us? Is it possible that God could be calling us to think differently about how we do church? We thought that certainly God might have something to say about this in the context of our discussions, because after all, we were, again, as I said, we were sitting on many multi-million dollars worth of property, and some of us assumed that all of the options should be on the table as we consider God's direction. So needless to say, we were pretty discouraged when we heard that some of the people in higher levels of leadership had already determined that we didn't need to consider anything related to our property. They had believed that because God gave us the property a long time ago, He gave it to us then, and there was an assumption that God doesn't want us to think anything differently about that now. And so anything related to the property was not on the table for discussion, even though we never really prayed about that particular decision to not talk about it. So we didn't see God's leading on whether a discussion around the property should be on the table. Didn't even have that sort of prayerful, discerning discussion. It wasn't that we weren't going to consider selling some of the property. It was really that we assumed that God didn't have anything to say about it. And we therefore didn't need to consult Him with that sort of question. That was kind of off the table because we had already made our own decision. And so in my opinion, I was pretty frustrated because I think it short-circuited the whole discernment process, because we had already decided that we knew best about some of the foundational realities of our church, And so there were some things that were just flatly off the table to consider. We weren't going to talk about those things. And so I come back to the statement that I started with just a moment ago. Undertake nothing without consulting God. You know, God may or may not have had something to say or may about that particular decision with the previous church that I was a part of. God may or may not have something to say about every one of our decisions in life. But the point is that as people who are living in submission to Him, living in submission to His lordship and His authority over our lives, we should always be desiring God's involvement in our lives and in our decision making, and not to assume that He isn't concerned or He has nothing to say about those things. And so let's take a look at what James has to say about this. And we're going to be looking at James chapter 4. And I encourage you, again, it's not going to be on the screens, but I encourage you to open a Bible if you'd like to, or look at a Bible app on your phone. We're going to be in James chapter 4, starting at verse 13. And so I'd like to read this to you now, these first several verses. He says, "Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this city or to that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them." Now let me ask a question. Now I'm obviously not able to see the hands raised, but I want to encourage you to raise your hands regardless. How many of you here in the room like to plan? You're a planner. You like to make plans in advance. I mean, I'll admit, I do. Based on personality, some people like to make plans and other people like to fly by the seat of their pants. And I'm one of those planner types. I enjoy making plans. You know, this past summer, our family took a road trip to Texas and Louisiana to see family and friends. And when we first decided that we were going to make the trip, and after we got confirmation that we could stay with family and friends in both places, I went to work on figuring out where we would stay on the way out and on the way back on our traveling to get there and to get home. I spent considerable time researching the best hotels to stay in for the most affordability and the best accommodations for our family of 6. I spent a lot of time calculating the best places to stay for cost and accommodations, also in keeping with the amount of distance that we would have to travel each day and what cities we should stay in so that we wouldn't overdo it in terms of the driving. And then once all of those plans and reservations had been made, I would go back periodically and I would recheck the hotel rates and to see if the rates had dropped so that I could cancel the existing reservation and book a new one under the lower rate. So yes, I guess you could say I like to make plans. You know, it's not that making plans is a bad thing. It's how we don't consult God with those plans, or how we hold those plans loosely for God to intervene. You know, many of us struggle in this regard. We would rather have control over our own lives and our own decisions because things are a lot more predictable that way. We can make things safer than if we get God involved. If get God involved, it may mix things up a bit. That may be called a little more challenge or risk. You see, we are enlightenment-based people. And so what does this mean? I've shared this before, but I'll come back to it here this morning. The Enlightenment, sometimes called the Age of Enlightenment, was a late 17th and 18th century intellectual movement emphasizing reason, individualism, and skepticism. The Enlightenment presented a challenge to traditional religious views of faith, trust, and seeking God with decision-making, etc. As a society, we still hold to these values in many different ways. We tend to value our own logic and reason and individualism over a life given to faith and trust and submission to God. We are skeptical about the things that we cannot see or that we can't prove. To believe in the supernatural or miracles is seen more as a non-intellectual, naive way to live life. And so as a result, the idea of waiting on God, the idea of trusting Him with our lives and the decisions of our lives, and living in this place of daily dependence on Him doesn't sit well generally with us as a people, because it goes against every cultural foundation that we're born into as children or products of the Enlightenment. And so when we talk about not doing anything without consulting God, it seems insane. It seems naive. It seems ridiculous. We would say things like, well, we don't need to pray about everything because God has given us brains and He's given us a will, and we should use those brains and use our will. And if we pray and wait on God for things to get done and for God to answer, we'll never get anything done. We'll just be sitting around on our hands all day long. It's true that God has given us a brain and He's given us a will. But really, it's the Enlightenment power foundation in our culture which teaches us that our brain and our will should be the first source of dependence over trust in God. It's not that the brain and the will are bad, it's that their rightful place is living subject and in submission to God's will and God's direction, not the other way around. Perhaps if we did a better job of waiting on God and trusting Him with all the decisions of our lives, the big decisions and the small decisions, instead of us coming back and saying we're not getting anything done, we would instead come back after living in this way of submission to God, and we would say, you know what, we got the right things done at the right time. Maybe not as been as efficient as we could have done on our own, but we got the right things done at the right time. And so this way of thinking seems to line up well with James' teaching here. And I want to go back and look at these verses a little bit more closely. Looking at verses 13 and 14. He says, "Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, we'll spend a year there and carry on business and make money. Why, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes." We can relate to James' words here in verse 13. We make plans for our jobs. We make plans for trips and vacations. We make plans for our living situations and whether to buy this house or to buy that car. Many times we make these decisions without even thinking about God. We make these decisions subconsciously or based on what the culture tells us we need or we should have. And we don't bring God into the process. And if we do, maybe it's kind of to hopefully slap His approval on it on the back end without really consulting Him through the discernment process. So we make these decisions a lot of times subconsciously. And so many times we live lives from a place of what I'm going to call living atheism. And we may believe in our hearts and in our minds that God exists, but the way that we live our lives and how we make decisions many times can be devoid of God's existence. We make those decisions based on maybe sometimes the self and what we want and not on God. And so we believe with our mind and heart that God exists, but functionally we live as atheists as if God does not exist in our decision making. And then James goes on in verse 14 and he says that we make all these plans for the future and it means nothing because we can die the very next day after we make these plans. And so let's view our lives from the proper perspective. The course of our lives is small, it's limited. We are a mist, we are a mere breath that will vanish very quickly. We don't know the future as much as we try to plan and predict it. And so the way forward, really the only way forward for us, is to live in a constant place of trust and dependency on God in our decision making. This of course doesn't mean that I can't use my mind or I shouldn't use my mind and my will. But I think we could probably back off a little bit of our dependency on ourselves a bit more and bring God more into the picture. Look what James says in verse 15. He says, instead, you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. And so James very specifically calls us to bring God into our daily decision making under the perspective that all that we do is under God's authority and with the awareness of our dependency on Him for life. He goes on to say in verses 16 and 17, as it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. I think James, in a variety of ways here, is saying that sometimes we value the schedule or we value the plan other than God's direction. Because frankly, God's direction would be too inconvenient, or it might mess with my bottom line or my living situation. So we can quickly dismiss the small voice of the Spirit and go on our merry way and start calling the shots again for our own lives. James calls this sin. When God makes us aware of what we should do, but we don't do it out of inconvenience or that it may wreck our plans and our schedule, it is sin. He goes on to talk about the implications of this way of living in chapter 5, verses 1 to 6, where he continues this way of thinking. Look with me at verses 1 through 6 of James chapter 5. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. You see, the result of living lives based on our own planning and decision making leads us to selfishness. It leads us to valuing our own wealth and comfort. It leads us to forgetting about those in need. And even worse, it leads us to enacting injustice upon others that are in need, and it just continues to support the cycle. And so the end result here is not pretty. And so we don't want to live this way. We don't want to live according to the way that James describes the rich. We don't want our situation to be this way. And so what does it practically mean to bring God into our daily decision making? I mean, this is the million-dollar question, right? Give me some practical ways to do this, Darren. What does it look like to bring God into my daily decision making? Well, I'm going to give you 6 things that stand out to me that might be helpful in this regard. The first one is this. It starts with a prayer acknowledging that you actually want Him to be a part of your daily decision making. It starts with a prayer asking Him to help you be more aware of the times to consult Him. This is a big step. Do you really want God's guidance and opinion, even on the small things in your life? Do you want His guidance, His direction in these areas? You know, it starts with a heart issue. Again, it starts with submission. Do I want God's involvement? Or do I want to continue to live with me making those decisions devoid of God's existence? And so it starts there. It starts with this prayer, acknowledging that you want God to be a part of your decision making. God, Jesus, I want you to be a part of all my decisions. Help me to be more aware of the times during my day when I can consult with you and talk with you about these things, and to learn to listen to what you may have to say. Second, you can create visual reminders to alert you to God's abiding presence right now in the situations that you're currently in. I mean, I did that by mentioning this, right? By creating this note, putting it on the back of my phone. I see that all the time as a reminder. And so half the battle is just learning to be more aware of God's ongoing presence with us all the time. That's half the battle, being aware that He's there. And so if we can become more aware of this and we're more aware of God's presence, then talking with God about the situations and the decisions that are before us is much more doable. Okay, so create visual reminders to alert you to God's abiding presence in the situations that you find yourself in. Third, ask God to help you see the world and your events and desires through His eyes. This is very important. Ask God to help you see the world and your events and your desires through His eyes. This is a good daily prayer. And we are completely dependent on God to carry it out in us. It's not something we can do. We can pray, but we are dependent on God to give us his eyes, to see our world and our events and our desires through his eyes. You see, if our eyes are more in tune with seeing things the way God does, then we're more likely to do things differently in response to that awareness. It becomes more natural for us to bring God into our decision making because we're seeing with God's eyes and we're acting in ways in faith and in trust and dependency on him for whatever the situation is before us. And so ask God to help you see your world and your events and desires through his eyes. Fourth, begin practicing in small ways. Begin practicing in small ways. Force yourself to pause during the day and to bring God into the small decisions. Perhaps a visual note will help, a visual note that you put on the back of your phone or on the dash of your car or somewhere you're going to see it every day. Maybe a visual note that says something like pause and ask, as a reminder to pause and to practice asking God to be involved in your small daily decisions. These are questions where it may sound a little silly initially, right? But what do you want me to eat right now? What do you want me to watch or to listen to right now? What do you want me to do right now? God may or may not have something specific to say to you about those small tasks, or he might. But the deeper point, too, is that we're learning the practice of involving him, seeking him in all of our decisions. There's a sense of discipline that's there, a sense of fostering and creating a culture for our lives that is open and wanting God to be involved in all of our decisions. So begin practicing in small ways. Fifth, seek to honor, praise, and worship God as you go through your routine tasks. Seek to honor, praise, and worship God as you go through your routine tasks. A book was written about the life of a guy by the name of Brother Lawrence, and it was called Practicing the Presence of God. You may have heard of it. I've referred to it before. It's the story of how a man practiced daily community and daily communion with God in the small and mundane activities of his life, through washing dishes and cleaning floors. And so seek to honor, praise, and worship God as you go through routine tasks. Sometimes the goal isn't necessarily to make a decision or to get something done. The goal is to connect with God and to actually praise him for the gift of being able to make that decision or to be able to do that task. So let's not miss the ability to praise and to worship and to honor God in the midst of our decisions, for the very opportunity we have to live life and to be able to be confronted with making choices and decisions that we desire to honor him with. And then sixth, begin practicing in big ways. Remember, 4 was begin practicing in small ways. Now I'm saying begin practicing in big ways. I think all of us here this morning probably have a significant decision in our lives at some level that needs to be made. Everybody's different. Everybody's got different things going on, but we all carry with us significant decisions that need to be made for our lives. And I want to encourage you to identify that significant decision or two, whatever it may be. Don't think too hard about it. You don't have to rack your brain and think, well, is that significant enough or not? You know. What is something that's important to you right now that you really would like God's direction and guidance with? And I want you to take time and I want you to offer that to him in prayer. Give him that decision. And ask him for his peace. And then take time to just wait in silence. Wait in silence. Offer him that decision. Offer him that situation. And then just sit, maybe for just 5 minutes in silence with him, holding that. Maybe extend your hands holding that decision for him, or that decision out to him. And then after you've waited for 5 minutes or so, I want you to start paying attention to what rises up in you. What's going on inside of you? You've asking God for a sense of his direction in this decision. And so trust that he wants to speak to you. And so pay attention to what thoughts and emotions and things are rising up in you as you hold that before him. And if you have a sense that he's calling you to act on something, then act on it. Sometimes it may go against logic. But risk, act, try. Maybe you need to hold this before him for several days before you feel comfortable acting, and there's wisdom in that as well. But the point is to begin with some of these larger decisions, to seek him with them, and then to pay attention to what he's doing in our heart and our life as we offer it to him, and then start to read what's going on inside of us, how the Spirit may be moving us to respond or to act in this particular way, in regards to this decision that we're trying to make. And so hopefully that's helpful to you. I'll review these again, these 6 ways in which the 6 ways that we can really practically begin to bring God into our daily decision making. Again, we said it starts with a kind of a prayer acknowledging that you actually want him to be a part of your decision making. And so you ask him to help you be more aware of the times in your life to consult him. And then second, we said create visual reminders to alert you to God's abiding presence right now in the situations that you're in. Third, ask God to help you see the world and your events through his eyes. 4, begin practicing in small ways. 5, seek to honor, praise, and worship God as you go through routine tasks. And 6, begin practicing in not just the small ways, but in big ways, with big decisions. And so let's close this morning by asking God for his grace to help us with these things, because we need his help to accomplish this. And so would you pray with me? Jesus, we lift this to you this morning. We ask for your help. We want to have you more involved in our everyday decisions. That you would move us away from an unhealthy dependence on our own wisdom and intellect and the natural flow of our lives. We want to consciously and intentionally pay more attention to your presence in our lives and to have your involvement more in our routine and daily decision making, not just the big things, but the small things as well. We want to live in an abiding relationship with you where there is a sense of, we have a sense of your peace and your wisdom and your direction for all things in our lives, not just the things that are financially significant or have a big impact long-term from our perspective. But even the small things, the small decisions, the small relationships, would you help us to live in this place of abiding and listening and following what you lead us to do? And so we ask that you would help us with that. We need your help. And we thank you for loving us and caring for us enough to hold us and to guide us and to lead us in this way. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Thanks again for being with us this morning. Hope you have a great rest of your Sunday. We'll see you again next week.